Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Kate Boyd and I'm so glad you're here. Today we're going to talk about wrist circles at the piano. A wrist circle is simply a motion that involves tracing a circle in the air with your wrist. So you see I'm putting my hand here and I'm actually initiating a motion with my wrist. Wrist circles can go counterclockwise in motion or they can go clockwise in motion. What a wrist circle will help you do is group multiple notes together and play them as a group in one physical and musical gesture. This will help you play more musically because not all notes should be played equally. Some notes you want to go all the way to the bottom of the key, some notes you want to be more on the surface of the key. Playing with wrist circles helps you go to the bottom and then also lift your arm weight out of the piano and play more on the surface. To practice the fundamental wrist circle motion, you can close the fallboard of your piano or sit at a table. You don't even have to be at a piano. And put your hand on the fallboard with a flat wrist. And now what I'm going to do is my fingers are loose on the tabletop and I'm drawing a circle with my wrist. Okay, so that is a counterclockwise wrist circle and this is a clockwise wrist circle. You can do that in both hands. Okay, now too often I see students play with a completely locked wrist. So it's possible you will try this exercise and just feel like you can't even get moving. If that's you, it's worth spending a little bit of time really getting comfortable with this motion, which is initiated from the wrist. Notice that the elbow is moving, but it's only moving in response to the arm motion that the wrist initiates. Notice that I'm not doing this. Watch my elbow. I'm not going like this, right? It is all happening with the wrist. Also, notice that the fingers, as I do this motion, the fingers change their alignment to the keys. And what the wrist circle will help you do is help you be perfectly aligned at that moment where the finger plays the key by bringing the finger around into position. So that's an introduction to wrist circles. Now I'm going to show you how to apply wrist circles to repertoire and where to find places where you can use wrist circles in various pieces. The first example of wrist circles that I'm going to show you today is from Czerny's School of Velocity. It's number 6 here, and it's a perfect example of wrist circles in the right hand, and it's a good opportunity to practice this motion and get comfortable with it inside some repertoire. So here's how it goes. You could play it with a fixed wrist and isolated fingers, and that's what this would look like. So you see that my wrist is fixed into place, my thumb is working independently, and all my fingers like this. I'm kind of over curving too because I'm trying to isolate each finger. Now, we don't want to isolate the fingers. We want to use wrist circles to play groups of notes. Here's how to play wrist circles in this context. We drop on the thumb, and so this is the bottom half of the circle. We come around, and as we come up, we play 4, 3, 2. That's the top half of the circle. So the circle is counterclockwise, so we go over and up. Notice that when I play the 4th finger, which is the top note of the figure, my wrist is still not high. I'm not going. Some people accidentally do that. We're going to come around, and then as you go down, then the wrist comes up. So this is that motion. And then all you do when the notes change is still apply the wrist circle, but it's different fingers. So now I'm going to 5. I'm playing 5, lifting and coming around. And then I'm changing the configuration. One thing you got to be careful of is that you don't accent the thumb too much. The thumb is a strong finger and we don't want it to sound like, right? So you got to kind of play, and as you play, already be moving your wrist around to the 4th finger, right? I want to point out to you also that part of the function of the wrist is to move the fingers into position so that they can play well. And if you notice, I'm playing the thumb, and look at how my fingers are diagonal. They're not aligned to the key. We want the fingers to be aligned this way to the keys. So one of the things that the wrist does is it brings the finger around so that when we play the fourth finger is aligned. And then we come around, and those fingers are aligned too, and then we pivot on the second finger a little bit with the wrist, and then come around. All right, so that's how that looks. And as you play faster, it's the same motion, but it's much smaller. Here it is faster. Now here, going to a black key, it's the same idea, just that the black key's a little higher. So that is that example for the Czerny. Another example from the School of Velocity, by the way, is number 3, because that it consists of ascending broken arpeggios. It goes like this. The whole thing just is this pattern. And so this involves going around the bottom half, playing on the bottom half of the circle. In the first example, we were descending. In this example, we are ascending. Ascending. So it's the same principle. You drop into the thumb, come around with the wrist, trace a semicircle, and then as you come up, you're coming up on 5 in order to go back down on the next one, right? So here's how it looks in slow motion. Notice I'm coming around on the thumb. And again, this is what it looks like isolated. It's very uncomfortable for me to play that way. And you can do it with isolated fingers, especially at a slow tempo, but that becomes very unreliable and very difficult to do at a fast tempo. This is what that sounds like. The end part, we're not using wrist circles for this part. This is rotation. But we're not going to talk about that today, because today we're talking about wrist circles. The next example of wrist circles that I'm going to show you is from Bach's Prelude, from his Prelude and Fugue in D minor, from Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. The way we're going to use wrist circles is we're going to start on the pinky, do a slight rotation, kind of roll over the hand. My friend and colleague, Dr. Stephen Pierce at USC, he calls this rolling hand. I love that idea that you roll over the notes. But notice when you're doing it, you're also making a wrist circle, right? This is what it looks like with isolated fingers. See how different that looks? It looks like my fingers are each just individually lifting this way, which is actually really hard on your upper arm. If you do that, you're working against yourself because you're lifting and then trying to push down. But using it this way, we're using larger muscle groups to maneuver the fingers into position. So to apply wrist circles to this one, we're going to start with the wrist in a neutral position, and then as you play 5, trace the top half of a circle. So we're coming over the top. Then we have to open the hand to play this octave and come around this way, right? Then we jump. In my playing, I'm exaggerating the motion so you can really see it. In real life, it's very small because this is quite a fast piece. You don't want to do large motions because the fingers still do have to work independently. piece. So what you're doing is you're starting each musical group on the last triplet of each group of 3, and that is going to be the foundation of the wrist circle. One thing you want to be careful of is that you don't accent the first or last note of the wrist circle. The wrist circle has nothing to do with either metric placement, like where it is in the meter or the measure. It also has nothing to do with accents. And so you want to avoid going like, right, something like that, or that's a completely separate thing from the motion we're doing in order to group the 3 notes together, right? Actually, we want a slight emphasis on the second note because that's on the beat. And the way you get that to be a little bit louder is just as you pass over that finger, your finger just goes down a tiny little bit faster, because the faster the key speed is, the louder the note is. The next example of wrist circles in action that I'm going to show you is from the 3rd movement of Beethoven's Opus 31 No. 2, the Tempest Sonata. This is a figure that recurs throughout. Right? Okay, so often I see and hear people play, students play it like this. Right? Right, so we want to avoid isolating the fingers and locking the wrist, and so it's going to be. Notice that the wrist circle starts on the thumb and it goes around the highest note. Again, it has nothing to do with the meter of the piece. So what I mean by that is we're going to trace from the thumb to 5, down, around, and up, down, around, and up. Then I trace the top part of the circle, 4, 3, 2. However, I'm not all the way back around because I have to finish the circle and go back around to the thumb. So that's my circle. Right? Then we have one little rotation because the notes go back and forth. And then wrist circle, rotation. And then wrist circle, right? All of this is wrist circle. That using wrist circles doesn't just make it easier to play and group the notes together, but it also sounds better. I'm going to play what I just played, or part of what I just played for you, with isolated fingers. And I want you to notice how the notes don't sound as grouped and it doesn't sound as phrased. And I promise you, I'm not trying to play it unmusically. It's just that it's so much harder to play musically when you're playing each individual note as opposed to grouping them with the wrist. Tell you that was so much less comfortable for me to play. My fingers were overcurved, my hands were extended, they weren't being flexible of opening and closing, and it didn't sound like there was a phrase being built. So that's another purpose of wrist circles, is we do this technical gesture of grouping notes together for a musical purpose. Now I'm going to show you really briefly what it looks like and sounds like for this to be played faster, because these are fast wrist circles, so they're really, really little when you play them in tempo. Okay, so you can still see my wrist moving, but I wasn't doing like these big, giant, exaggerated motions. The next example of wrist circles I'm going to show you is from Chopin's Nocturne, Opus 55, number 1. This is in F minor, and this is a very popular nocturne, which is why I chose it. Plus, I have a student currently learning it. I want to show you how to use wrist circles when the notes and the tempo of the piece are slower. So this piece is pretty slow and contemplative, and it goes like this. So you may recognize this piece. And we have this figure that's very similar to the very first example I showed you, which was, right? It's a slowed down version of that same contour. It's, right? So we start here on the thumb and we go around. So one way to use wrist circles here is to do very slow motion version of that motion that we did with the Czerny, right? So we start here, dropping into the thumb, and then we're coming around to there. And then again, wrist circle, bottom half of the wrist, and then we come around the top and to the C, and then we do a little bit of rotation there, and again another wrist circle. What's the purpose of doing a wrist circle on very, very slow notes? Well, it is to help with the musical grouping of notes into a phrase. So even at a very slow tempo, we don't want it to sound like this. We don't want every note to be the same. And so by using the wrist to group, we're manipulating how the arm weight is being transferred into the keys. We're, in a way, by lifting out and playing over the top part of the circle, the arm is being lifted out of the keys. But I want to point out, this motion is not initiated by the elbow. We're not lifting from here. It's definitely a wrist motion. That's a really good way to help yourself phrase. I'm looking now in measure 21. So I'm doing this wrist circle, then immediately another wrist circle, and then another wrist circle, another wrist circle. So it's one circle after another. Sorry about my notes. Right, so I'm using wrist circles to help with the phrasing. And I know that you've seen pianists play slow music using quite a lot of arm motion. And you may have wondered, well, it's just single notes. Why are they moving their arm? And that's the reason. The piano is a percussion instrument. When we have a note that we play, it immediately is going to die and decay. And so this is a way of linking those notes together and helping create a longer phrase. I'm going to show you two more places in this nocturne where you can apply wrist circles, just very briefly, because they're really everywhere. Once you start to see where you can apply wrist circles, then you're going to be seeing them really in all of your repertoire in many, many opportunities. So here's measure 33. Here we have two ascending pieces. This ascends and then this ascends. And for both of those, we're going to use a wrist circle. So we're going to come around the bottom of the circle, and then we're going to come around the top to start the next one on the E flat, and we're going to come around the bottom of that one too, right? So basically it goes, and then wrist circle, and then here, wrist circle, right? So wrist circle there is ascending and going around the bottom of the circle, whereas the first example I showed you was descending and it went around the top of the circle, and the circle is counterclockwise in both cases. The final place I want to show you in this piece is in the Piu Mosso when it gets faster. Here, a lot of times people will isolate and they'll just go, right? And it's very hard to coordinate with their hands together. But if you have both hands moving in a wrist circle, then it's much easier because you're really just doing that motion in parallel. Both hands will do a counterclockwise circle the bottom part of that, so it'll be like that in both wrists. This is circle, circle, rotation. Circle, circle. Right, so looking for those places where it goes up and then reverses direction, or it goes down and reverses direction, that's often a good opportunity to use a wrist circle. Now, wrist circles don't operate just completely on their own. We have to use other kinds of technique in order to play the vast amount of repertoire that we have available to us as pianists. I made a whole video about rotation that you should check out. It's a comprehensive guide to rotation at the piano. So head on over there. I'll see you there, and happy practicing.